I see that probably a good portion of us were not here last Sabbath. So we want to talk a little bit about what we learned last Sabbath. Some of you remember well, and some of you might have forgotten a few things, but we began last Sabbath with Matthew 25, where there were 10 virgins who were planning to meet the bridegroom. And when he came, 5 were ready and went into the party, and 5 got detoured and eventually showed up at the party and knocked at the door, and the bridegroom said, "I don't know you." Did it matter? It mattered. They didn't get into the party, and they were out where there was weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth. So it was important to know the bridegroom. Jesus said in John the 17th chapter, "This is life eternal, that they might know thee, the only true God, and Jesus Christ." So is knowing God important? It's life and death. It's important. It's vital. And what is one indication we have that God has time to get to know us? It's that date that He set with us. Once a week. We read in Genesis, the 2nd chapter, that after creation was finished, verse 3, God blessed the Sabbath day and sanctified it, because in it He had rested from all His work which God created and made. And we suggested it could be a little bit like this. God blessed the Sabbath day and sanctified it, or set it apart, a little bit apart. He made it holy. And for someone to say, "Oh, I can be blessed any day of the week." Was that true? Absolutely. You can be blessed any day of the week. But if I went here and looked for my Sabbath blessing, is that where it is? No. So where would I go to get a Sabbath blessing? I would go where God put it, right? We talked about that last Sabbath. We would go where God placed the blessing. That's where we would find it, because He blessed it. I'm not the one who blesses it. We shared how my roommate in college went over to the ladies' dorm to meet his date on Friday night to escort her to the church. And he waited, and he waited, and he waited, and he waited. And eventually he realized she's not coming. How did that help their relationship to flourish? Didn't really help, did it? Yet how many people, when God says, "We've got a 24-hour date, I'm coming by your place, be ready," how many people tend to leave God waiting in the lobby? Because they're busy, got things to do, tired out, or maybe they're dating somebody else. Talked about that last Sabbath. I was interested just yesterday to notice an article in the Adventist Review from the June edition, written by Bathsheba. And I think she has a nice idea here. She says that the Sabbath is a date with God. Thought, well, maybe we weren't so far off last week. Here's somebody else who got the same idea. Sabbath is a date with God. If I'm going to get to know God, how would I get to know somebody? Probably spend some time together on a consistent basis. Spend some time. Does God have time for us? Absolutely. Do we have time for Him? That's the question. That's an important question to consider. Sabbath was designed to be a blessing. Certainly it can be perverted and even become the opposite of its intended purpose, but it doesn't need to be that way. As Adventists, we find significance in Revelation, the 14th chapter. I invite you to look there, unless you have it memorized. We're thinking of particularly verse 6 and 7 of Revelation 14. We call this the first angel's message, where we read in verse 6 about an angel flying, having the everlasting gospel to proclaim to every nation, kindred, tongue, and people. And what is that gospel? Verse 7, fear God, give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment is come. Worship him that made heaven, the earth, the sea, and the fountains of waters. This is the gospel. Worship God who made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and the fountains of waters. The book of Revelation is filled with phrases from the Old Testament, which would have been the scriptures of John's day. That was his Bible, the Old Testament. We call these reflective phrases allusions because they allude to a passage in the Old Testament, something from the law or the prophets or the writings. So what is John referring to when he writes in the 14th chapter of Revelation about worshiping the one who made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and the fountains of waters? Is he thinking of a specific passage in the Old Testament? Are there any places in the Old Testament that talk about God making the heavens and the earth and the sea? Yes, there are Old Testament passages. For instance, Psalm 136 says, by wisdom he laid out the heavens, and by his hand he stretched out the earth. Was John thinking of Psalm 136? Why, later in that chapter you even find the word sea. It talks about the Red Sea in Psalm 136. Was John thinking of that chapter? Well, how would we know? Are there any other clues to help us determine what John was thinking about? Because there's another passage, Exodus 20, where we read about, remember the Sabbath, who God in 6 days made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and all that is in them. Is that the passage John was thinking about? Heavens, earth, sea, that's a fairly strong connection. There's another connection that is helpful in creating a tie, that John was clearly thinking of the fourth commandment when he wrote these words. Because as we read on in Revelation 14, we find in verse 12 this statement, blessed are those, here are they who keep the commandments of God. The testimony of Jesus Christ. So was John thinking about Psalm 136 when he wrote these words in Revelation 14? Probably he was thinking of Exodus 20, the commandments of God. So when there's to be a loud voice saying, fear God and give glory to him, the hour of his judgment has come, worship him who made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and the fountains of waters, Adventists see in this passage a special call to worship the Creator in light of commandment number 4, to remember the Sabbath, God's invitation for a date with us. It's a strong appeal to worship God in a specific way as the Creator, the one who made us. We do that by respecting the Sabbath, the seventh day. On Sabbath, we remember our origin, and we remember our destination as well. Hebrews, the 4th chapter. Hebrews chapter 4. Turn a few pages back from Revelation. Hebrews chapter 4, beginning in verse 9. We read, "There remaineth therefore a rest to the people of God. For he that has entered into his rest has also ceased from his own works, as God did from his. Let us labor, therefore, to enter into that rest, lest any man fall after the same example of unbelief." He says there remains a rest to the people of God. Sabbath rest is identified in verse 4, where we read about the Sabbath being a specific time, the seventh day. God rested from all his works. In a perfect world, God Almighty rested from his work. If God thought it was important to rest, is it important for us? Would seem so. If God rests on the seventh day, why not join him in resting? Hebrews 4, verse 9 affirms that there remains a Sabbath rest to God's people, a time where God can sanctify them, make them holy, a time where we rest trusting in the saving grace of Jesus, confident in his ability to save us. Why doesn't the whole world make every effort to savor that rest each week? Could it be because Revelation 14, there's a special call to worship God, the one who made, as if people are not doing that? Who are they worshiping? Revelation 13, we read that they are worshiping the beast. They're worshiping the image to the beast. In a time when the world tends to worship the beast, there's a call in Revelation 14 to worship God as creator, the one who made us, one who knows our need. Could it be the one who wanted to have power to create, who wanted to set his throne above God's, who wanted to be worshiped, who even tried to tempt Jesus to fall down and worship him, the one who seeks to bring dishonor to God and pain to all of God's creation, desperately wants to keep people from their relationship with their Creator. He seeks to undermine anything that God does. He suggests there's an alternative to God as Creator. What's that alternative? Well, often people talk about evolution. He seeks to suggest there's an alternative to a weekly date with God. There's an alternative. No wonder the writer of Hebrews appeals, make every effort to enter that rest, as if apparently it's not going to happen if you go with the flow. There will be resistance. As you might have noticed in the reading in the bulletin from our high calling, it talks in there about some resistance, some difficulty, some trouble. Apparently, not everyone's going to worship God in the Hebrews 4 fashion without some labor, because the devil will suggest 101 reasons to keep you from entering that rest. The seventh-day rest that honors God as the Creator and trusts in his perfect work, not ours. His ability to sanctify and recreate us. Only God can do that. Genesis 2 says that God finished his work and rested on the seventh day and blessed the seventh day and sanctified it and set it apart for a holy purpose. What is that purpose? Is that purpose to inconvenience people? Sounds almost sacrilegious to say that, yet how many people treat it like that? an intrusion into their life. Exodus chapter 31, verse 13. Exodus 31, verse 13 says, "Speak to the children of Israel, saying, Verily, my Sabbath ye shall keep, for it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I am the Lord that doth sanctify you," or make you holy. I am the Lord who sanctifies you. It goes on in the chapter to say in verse 16 that this is a perpetual covenant throughout your generations. The Sabbath is a perpetual covenant. Isn't that good news? When would we ever outgrow our need for God's sanctifying power, for his touch in our lives? Verse 17 of the chapter says, "It is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed." Refreshed. It says God was refreshed. Isn't that beautiful? If God could benefit from refreshing, could we? We live in a generation where some think refreshment comes from what you drink. How often have you asked someone how they are, and they say, "Oh, I'm refreshed"? Might it be refreshing to hear someone say that? So many today push, push, push. Push, push. Bills to pay. A frantic pace of constant activity. You only live once, they say. But sadly, some don't live even once. Because to truly live, we must come to Jesus, the life giver, who says, "I want you to live abundantly. I want you to truly live." To do that, we need rest. It's in resting that God can do his sanctifying work in our hearts. Maybe you can comprehend the lunacy of expecting your mechanic to change your oil and perform a tune-up while you're driving to Flagstaff. If you ask him to do that, he might protest. No, you need to bring the car in. And you say, "Oh, I'm far too busy to bring the car in. I've got errands to run. I've got things to do. School's starting next week." How about this? I'll swing by the shop and pop the hood. You grab the supplies and get to work. I'll try to keep it under 65. You'll get lots of fresh air. What would he say? Or if it's a lady mechanic, what would she say? I think she would protest. She would say, "Well, how will you see when you're driving with your hood up?" And I would ask you, how many people do you see trying to operate with their hood up? Not literally, but seriously. Having the hood up is a sign that this vehicle is probably needing some help. If the car beside the road has their hood up, they need an intervention. But how many live their life trying to drive with their hood up? Eventually their motor seizes up or they crash. We need God's sanctifying touch. How do we get it? We need to keep our date with the master. He's a master mechanic as well. You have to park for him to access your heart. If you're doing that and he's doing that, won't you be refreshed? If you're not, you might want to review how you approach your weekly date with God. We're familiar with the experience of the Pharisees. They tended to add rule to rule to rule, to hundreds of rules in keeping their appointment with God, until it got to be so complicated, they forgot God was the one doing the work. sanctifying them, making them holy. They were so confused, they thought they were doing the work. The same could happen today. Verse 10 of Hebrews 4, as we had read, says, "For he that entered into his rest, he also has ceased from his own works, as God did from his." We cease from our work. Maybe you've heard someone suggest that taking God's offer of a seventh-day refreshment, a date, was works, legalism. For some Pharisees, it did become that. But for the people of God, it's an opportunity to rest from our works, as God did from his. What does it mean to rest from our works? Is it not having peace, confident in the saving grace of Jesus, his perfect work? Let us make every effort to enter that rest. Let's not be disobedient or unbelieving. Maybe someone has said to you, well, even Jesus broke the Sabbath. Anyone ever said that to you? Why did he break the Sabbath? John, the 5th chapter. We might notice that verse, John chapter 5. John, the 5th chapter, Jesus had done something that some of the Pharisees didn't appreciate too much. Jesus had healed someone on the Sabbath. And we read in verse 18 of John 5, "Therefore the Jews sought the more to kill him," referring to Jesus, "because he not only had broken the Sabbath, but it also said that God was his Father, making himself equal with God." Jesus had broken the Sabbath, someone says. So obviously he didn't have respect for the Sabbath. Well, it depends on what translation you're reading. But that's an interesting word. Broke, or destroyed, or loosed. If you look in the New Testament at how that word is translated, it's most commonly translated untie. Untie. As in, Jesus sent his disciples to fetch a colt. And to get that colt free, they untied the rope. They didn't destroy the rope or destroy the colt or break the rope or break the colt. They untied the colt. So untie is an appropriate way to translate this word when they say that Jesus broke the Sabbath. Sometimes it's translated destroy, as in John 2. Jesus said, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." It would seem that Jesus didn't say, "Untie this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." Destroy was an appropriate word there. But in Revelation, the 1st chapter, we find the same word. "To him who loves us and has destroyed us, has broken us?" No. "Who has freed us or untied us from our sins by his blood." Jesus has loosed us from our sins by his blood. So in John, the 5th chapter, if you were translating it there, one way to translate that word would be that Jesus had sought to untie the Sabbath. He wasn't breaking the Sabbath or destroying it. He was loosing it. He was freeing it from their nitpicky rules. Jesus had great respect for the Sabbath. He said, "I have not come to destroy the law or the prophets." Jesus respected the Sabbath. He just had a problem with how some people went about it. Jesus was recapturing the beauty of Sabbath, our date with God, stripping out the shag carpet to reveal the beautiful hardwood floor of the Sabbath. And we say, well, why would anyone ever cover that up? What were they thinking, or what were they not thinking? The gifted deceiver has a track record of contradicting God. In the garden, God said, "Do not eat that fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil." And Satan said, "Eat that fruit." God said, "You eat that, you will die." And Satan said, "You won't die. In fact, you'll live on in a higher plane of existence. You'll know good and evil." Why did that sound so appealing? Wouldn't it seem that's part of the mystery of iniquity? How Satan could make going against God sound appealing to someone. Yet many embrace the deceiver's message. They believe you really won't die. You just live on immortally. You may know someone who believes that. These truths that God made prominent in the garden, salvation and marriage and work and the Sabbath, are concepts we find in Eden, yet in our society today, many times so construed, misunderstood. Somehow people assume those lies must be right. Those insinuations that come from the deceiver. Is assuming a good thing? I'm sure this thing isn't loaded. I bet that road would be a really good shortcut, get us there a lot faster. No, it must be perfectly safe. Did you see how much weight Ted has lost on the bend ban? Must be a great thing. Well, eventually the FDA said, well, if you want to hang on to your heart valves, you might skip that. Oh, it must be perfectly safe. Or how about this? Surely Aunt Mildred and Uncle Billy would love for our family to come and stay with them for a week. Maybe we should surprise them. Is that a good assumption? It's good if you're right. If you're not right, it's going to be a long week. Is assuming a good thing? Sometimes. When Mom went down the drive where they're staying earlier this week and went out the gate to throw some trash in the can, and the gate opened part way and an alarm went off, she knew something was wrong. So she called me, and I came and took a look, and I noticed some wires there that looked like they might have been messed with. And we called a repairman, and he came out, and I pointed out those wires. I said, it looks like those, and he looked at those, but he went over to the brains of the gate operation, and he carefully took off the cover, and he pulled out a diagram, some instructions from in there. And he said, okay, it's running this code, certain number. And then he came over and looked at those wires that I had pointed out. And he said, you know, that could be the problem right there. Now, I had assumed that to begin with. Would have saved him time if he had just done that, right? But what did he do? He went to the manual and checked it out the way that he thought was the smartest way to approach it. I think he knew a valuable lesson. Because while assuming can save you time, sometimes when you assume wrong, you can waste time and get further behind. to bring it a little bit closer, suppose that I'm out riding my bicycle and I have my helmet on, and you see me dressed like this, and what could you assume? What might you think about me? Well, I can tell you what I think some people thought about me, because I heard a comment, "Oh, you've got to be kidding," as someone looked right at me. What could they be thinking? Here is someone who is so fearful that he's got to wear a mask even if he's out on a bicycle all by himself. This guy is crazy. I told you the world is going crazy. If they had had their camera handy, they would have snapped a picture, and they could have posted my picture with their blog and said, "People are riding around on their bicycles with masks on. People are nuts." Right? Would they be right? You have to be a little bit of a nut to ride a bicycle today. Now, why would anybody wear something like this on their face? You know, I've had melanoma in my past, and I tend to sunburn quite easily, and I've tried sunscreen, but I discovered that it tends to make my glasses slide down my nose, and when I put my finger up there to put my glasses back up, I get grease on my finger, and I don't really like that. And I wasn't sure that the chemicals in the sunscreen were all that good for me, so I, as some of you have noticed, we go on a hike, sometimes I wear something over my nose, like a piece of tape or something to shield me from the sun. And when COVID came, I discovered that not only does it cover my nose, it covers my lips too. And while I could have some of my nose cut off, I'd really like to hang on to my lips, because I'd rather not be slobbering around. So it didn't really cost me a whole lot to get this mask. I actually got it for free. Didn't even have to pay for sunscreen. And I cut some holes in it. I can breathe. And yet I'm protected from getting a little too much sun. So that person who I completely understand makes an assumption about me is completely wrong. No, I'm not trying to get away from COVID by wearing that mask. I'm trying to protect my skin from the sunshine, which sun isn't bad. It's just too much sun is not a good thing. So are assumptions good? They're good when you're right. And when you're wrong, they're not so good. Because here is illustration A of my hypothesis. People are crazy. And yet, maybe I am crazy, but not in the way that she was thinking. It's so clear, it's so obvious to them, especially if they want to believe that. What about assuming in spiritual realms? Oh, Ruth's a Christian. What she does must be the thing to do. Or, well, the pastor said, so it must be. We see that assumptions can be a shortcut to trouble. Job's friends assumed he had sinned in a significant way. Wasn't it obvious? Of course, it was obvious. Someone sees me and immediately knows my political leanings and how I'm living in fear, and yet they're so wrong. They want to believe I'm an example of stupidity. But let's not assume in spiritual things. Let's not assume that just because someone does something, that's the way a Christian does it. It's best to study it out for ourselves. to go to the brains, the box, and open it up and see what kind of a code it says in making a decision about where to put our energy. You might recall how after the children of Israel crossed the Jordan into the promised land, they set up a pile of rocks, a memorial. A man from each of the tribes had selected a stone from the riverbed. As they crossed, they carried them on their shoulder and then stacked them up at Gilgal. Joshua, the 4th chapter, tells us about this. And Joshua explained, when you're with your child someday, and they ask, hey, what's that pile of stones? You can tell the story. My child, we used to live on the other side of this river. We were slaves in Egypt, but God delivered us. He brought us out of there. We came to a dead end. We thought we were dead meat because the Egyptians were coming after us with horses and chariots, and we were up against the Red Sea. We were surrounded. But God is mighty. He dried up a path through the sea for us. He parted the waters. Everyone crossed safely. Then the Egyptians followed. They followed until walls of water collapsed on them. But God preserved us through the wilderness. And then he brought us to this river. He gave us a refresher course on who he was. You see, the grandmas and grandpas had all died by then. It was a new generation. They'd heard how God had made a dry path through the sea, but we hadn't seen it. We'd only heard of it. So God made a dry path through the river Jordan for us to cross to this side, our new home. We all crossed safely. My child, God did that. So all the people of the earth would know the hand of the Lord is mighty. So we would fear the Lord our God and follow him forever. It was a memorial, Joshua said, so that you would never forget. God cares for you. He brought you through. He can lead you through. Sabbath is a memorial. It's a marker. Every seventh day to remind us God is mighty. He created us. He created the heavens, the earth, the sea, and all that is in them. As our creator, he knows how to fix us, to repair us when we need repairs. He's big enough to do it. He has a mighty hand, and he's mighty handy at his craft. He does good work. He remembers that date every Friday night. Remember the Sabbath, he appeals, to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. Did you know he wants to be yours, your God? How can that happen? You need to have a relationship. Jesus made clear it's a life or death issue. John the 17th chapter, this is life eternal. From evening to evening, Leviticus 23 says, shall you celebrate your Sabbaths? He set aside 24 hours each week for a date with us. It's not about pausing from the routine for an hour to run to church and gain some merit. It's 24 hours reserved for fellowship with God, the one who loves us and with whom we say we want to spend eternity. Having a preparation day helps us to be ready for that date. In Luke 23, we find Jesus on the cross on preparation day as the Sabbath was approaching. Jesus' followers rested on the Sabbath. And then, even after 60 years had passed from Jesus' death, that weekly date with God was full of wonder. full of wonder. While Jesus was on this earth, there was one who was drawn closer to him than most others. He responded to Jesus with an open heart. We read of this disciple whom Jesus loved, John, the author of the gospel, which bears his name, and some epistles, and then the last look of Jesus. The last look at Jesus in the scriptures, the revelation of Jesus Christ. When was that revelation of Jesus given? Was it on a Thursday afternoon? Revelation chapter 1, verse 10 says, "On the Lord's day I was in the Spirit." When was the Lord's day? Jesus' favorite way of referring to himself was as the Son of Man. And he said in Mark the 2nd chapter, Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath day. John, his disciple, was familiar with the Lord's day as the Sabbath day. What more fitting a time to glimpse a picture of Jesus than on his day, the Sabbath? What more meaningful way to highlight John's Sabbath experience than to see his best friend walking through his church? Jesus walks in the midst of his church on Sabbath. How could I miss being where Jesus is? What could hold me back from placing myself where I'm most likely to hear Jesus say, "Fear not. I'm alive forever. Don't be overwhelmed with concern for your life. You're safe with me, whether you live or die. Whether you rest in the grave a few winks, I hold the keys." To his old friend, banished to a barren island for his faith, Jesus came on Sabbath to bring reassurance. This morning, Jesus repeats his words of reassurance. Fear not, my daughter, my son. I'm here, and I will remain forevermore. There remaineth therefore a rest to the people of God.